The location is Mount Everest. Early morning hours of May 26, 2006. A four-person team advancing on the north ridge of the 8,049-meter Mount Everest. At an altitude that pushes human limits, they were at the 8,500-meter mark of the mountain. This elevation, being extremely high above sea level, was very cold with very little oxygen. That's why it was called the death zone. American team leader Daniel Mazur, along with Canadian climber Andrew Brash, British climber Miles Osborne, and Nepalese high-altitude guide Sherpa Jangbu, had been climbing for 8 hours. The weather was calm, no wind, and the sky was crystal clear. Under these conditions, reaching their summit goal seemed easy. Only a few hours' distance remained to the summit. Despite the freezing cold, the team felt strong and healthy. They were on the verge of reaching the world's summit. Their dreams, however, at that very moment, while passing through a narrow path, the scene that appeared before them horrified them all. On the edge of a sharp rocky ridge, just one step away from approximately a 3,000-meter cliff, a man sat alone. No one had expected to encounter such a scene that morning. They were at 8,500 meters altitude, and the scene before them was like a thriller movie scene. At this altitude, where stopping for even 1 minute could lead to fatal consequences, the man in front of the team appeared calm, sitting cross-legged, as if he were sitting in a camp. The climber named Lincoln Hall was staring into space with his open brown eyes, having pulled down his thick climbing suit to his waist and taken his arms out of the suit. He had no hat on his head, no gloves on his hands, wasn't wearing sunglasses, and wasn't using an oxygen mask. He didn't even have an ice axe, water bottle, or food bag. The visible picture was that this man didn't possess the equipment necessary for survival. But what they didn't know was that this man had spent the night here. Mazur and his team initially thought Hall was dead or dying. When the team approached the climber, this man had lifted his head and barely managed to say, "You're surprised to see me here, aren't you?" This question caused everyone to freeze at that moment. The person in front of them was this man, despite all these incredible circumstances, was alive and trying to talk to them. They naturally had difficulty believing it. At over 8,000 meters altitude, this nearly half-naked man had miraculously survived a night without oxygen. The person in front of them was Australian, experienced climber Lincoln Hall. This wasn't his first high-altitude climb. In the past, he had climbed the 7,000-meter Dunagiri and successfully visited the summits of Annapurna and Makalu. So Hall was someone known and respected among climbers. But the situation was obvious. The team immediately understood their shock and quickly realized how critical Lincoln's condition was. He was showing symptoms of high-altitude cerebral edema, and his condition was urgent. He was hallucinating, delirious, and when he tried to speak, incoherent sentences came from his mouth. His body was shivering in an exhausted state, and there were severe frostbite marks on his fingers and face. He had also been without water for too long. His lips were cracked, and his consciousness was becoming increasingly blurred. Moreover, the strangest thing was that Hall had nothing on him to protect him from the cold. According to the team's initial estimates, because he showed no signs of life during the night, his guides had abandoned him, taking his protective clothing and equipment when they left. Although Mazur and his team were shocked by this scene, there was no time to discuss. They couldn't abandon this man who appeared before them at this altitude, as others had done. They hadn't thought they would make one of the most difficult decisions of their lives that day on Everest's summit route. Daniel and his team weren't strangers to such extreme conditions. Since the 1990s, they had made many climbs in the Himalayas and had eventually managed to reach 9 of the world's highest peaks. However, what really set Mazur apart from others wasn't just the summits he reached, but his stance of putting people's lives above everything else without just paying lip service. In the mountaineering community, Daniel was truly known for his selfless attitude, showing no hesitation in life-or-death situations he encountered. Because in the mountaineering community, when such a situation was encountered, generally that person would be left there. Yes, you heard correctly. The climber would be left there alone, and they would continue on their way, because the person was thought to be already dead. But Mazur had sacrificed his own oxygen and time to save a climber climber from the brink of death on Everest. And again in 1992, he had saved another climber's life on K2 in a similar way. In each of these events, he had given up the summit that was his goal. In fact, a few days earlier, a tragic event had occurred, and British climber David Sharp had lost his life because no one helped him. Sharp, just like Lincoln, had been stranded at high altitude, but unfortunately hadn't been as lucky as him. What was even more tragic was that about 40 climbers had passed the point where he was found that day, but none of them had been willing to abandon their summit goals to help. And in this scenario, Sharp had unfortunately frozen to death because people didn't help him. But Lincoln, unlike David, had fortunately encountered real people rather than those blinded by summit fever. Over the years, Daniel had repeatedly seen that mountains weren't just targets to be conquered, but also places where solidarity and humanity tests were given. The scene that appeared before him that day on Everest's danger-filled slope would perhaps be the biggest test of all Daniel's accumulated experience and character. When Daniel and his team found Lincoln alive, they quickly sprang into action after their initial shock. Just a few minutes earlier, they had the excitement of climbing to Everest's summit in their minds, but now they had turned all their attention to saving this exhausted climber's life. Climbing Everest is very expensive. Most climbers can only reach these summits through high-value contracts and sponsorships. But at that moment, no contract or goal could be more important than a human life. The team first set about addressing Hall's critical deficiencies. They immediately took out a spare hat and gloves from their own extra clothes and put them on Hall's head and hands. Wrapping his body, which had been left almost defenseless against the cold, was the first step to protect him from freezing. Then they gave Hall oxygen from their own oxygen tanks, trying to bring him to his senses somewhat. They put their water bottles to his lips, making him drink a few sips of water, and fed Hall the small amount of food they had left, aiming for him to gain energy. At this altitude, even swallowing a simple sip of water was difficult, and in this situation, Hall's consciousness was coming and going. Since Hall wasn't aware of what he was doing, he was making it difficult for the team trying to help him. During this time, our Daniel was on the radio, trying to contact the climbing team that Hall belonged to. When the radio call was answered, the first reaction of those who heard the news was disbelief, because Hall had been left there alone the day before, thought to have lost his life, and they had returned to camp, and his death had been announced to the whole world. On May 25th, he had managed to join the select few who had reached Everest's summit, but during the descent, he had begun to lose consciousness due to high-altitude sickness. The two Sherpa guides with Hall had tried to keep him alive for hours, around 700 meters, just below the technical passage called the second step. The Sherpas had tried to get Hall on his feet and walk him down, struggling for him for about 10 hours. However, as evening darkness fell, Hall had become unable to walk on his own, let alone react. While this was happening, the Sherpas' oxygen was about to run out and they were beginning to experience snow blindness. So the situation was critical. In this situation, while Hall couldn't move and had even lost consciousness, expedition leader Alexander Abramov had desperately stopped the rescue operation to avoid risking the lives of the remaining team members.
But yeah, look, I don't know what time it is, but I'll talk to you when I can. Okay, thanks. Bye.
The Sherpas, seeing no signs of life in Hall, had to leave him there and return. One of them had even lifted Hall's eyelid and gently touched his eye to check if Hall was really dead or not. But there was no reaction. Thinking there was nothing more they could do, they took Hall's backpack and remaining materials and began descending toward camp.
You can't, if he doesn't want to move because he's just become completely delirious, what can I do? And at what point do you decide that? Because otherwise you're going to have one dead climber plus 3 dead Sherpas.
Russian climber Abramov, when nothing could be done, had informed the advance camp that night, reporting that the climber had died. Even Hall's wife and family in Australia had been given the tragic news. But the next morning, a group was communicating via radio to Hall's team that Hall was alive. This was also an incredible situation. Hall didn't die. He's alive. We found him. We need help, Mazur was saying on the radio. Mazur had requested that they immediately send a rescue team. When Arumov and the others received news that their friend, whom they had left for dead the night before, was alive, they immediately sprang into action. Following the call, Hall's team immediately launched a rescue operation using all resources on the mountain. Climbers and Sherpas resting at different camps immediately went into alarm mode when they received this news. Meanwhile, Abramov had assembled a 12-person rescue team from his own team and other teams to rescue Hall, and they began rapidly advancing toward the location where Hall was found. This rescue operation would be an unprecedented rescue operation in Everest history. Mazur, meanwhile, was on the verge of another critical decision with his own team. The area they were in was only a few hundred meters from the summit. They were close enough to reach the world summit with one final push. Moreover, Brash and Osborne with Mazur had dreamed of this climb for years, preparing themselves mentally and financially. Each of them had spent tens of thousands of dollars to reach the summit, spending months with training and preparations for this moment. But now there was a man fighting for his life in front of them, and their achievements, the efforts they had made, and the money they had spent were automatically going to waste. But for them, a life weighed heavier. The team had unanimously agreed, without hesitation, they would have to turn back just a few hundred meters from Everest Peak. But it was worth it. As the hours progressed, the sun began to warm Everest's snow-covered ridge. The rescue team was trying to climb up as quickly as possible. Mazur and his team were waiting for help to come while staying with Hall, racing against time. Now you might ask why Mazur and his team didn't carry Hall down a bit further. But Mazur and his team were 4 people, and trying to lower a person who didn't know what he was doing at this altitude was very risky for both the team and Hall. Hall's mind was very unstable. He could sometimes only mumble responses to questions asked, sometimes sinking into deep silence. Each minute of waiting made this operation more dangerous. Hall was unconsciously moving himself closer to the edge of the cliff. Mazur and his team had tied Hall to the point where he was located with safety belts and ropes to secure him. They had now prevented him from rolling down meters in case of a sudden movement or fainting. But everyone was on edge, because Hall had become very weak and his body could give up at any moment. He could take his last breath in a few minutes. Daniel was trying to speak in a loud and clear voice, looking into Hall's eyes. They were somehow trying to keep him conscious, but Everest had much less oxygen compared to the rest of the world, and the point they were at had even less. In such an environment, let alone spending a few hours, this man had spent a night, so someone talking to him, keeping him conscious, might not be enough. Moreover, since they were sharing their oxygen with Hall and had spent a long time there, they themselves were beginning to get into danger. Under normal circumstances, a team that reached the summit could stay at the summit for 15 to 20 minutes. The point where the team was located had 70% less oxygen, and the air temperature was minus 30 degrees. But our team had spent about 4 hours motionless at this deadly altitude. As the sun rose, the air warmed up a bit, but this was Everest after all. The weather could change at any moment, and the clouds appearing on the horizon and light breezes were harbingers of an approaching storm. The team was checking Hall in turns, providing oxygen and water supplements in small sips. If the weather turned bad, neither Hall nor those trying to rescue him could survive. Fortunately, what was feared didn't happen, and after hours of waiting, moving silhouettes began to appear in the distance. The 12-person rescue team had come from the advance camps at 6,400 and 7,000 meters at extraordinary speed toward the point where Hall was located. And now a more difficult descent process was about to begin after that challenging ascent. The guides, with the hot drinks, oxygen tanks, and first aid materials they brought, were trying both to stabilize Hall and support our team. Mazur and his team took a deep breath with a mixture of fatigue and relief. But even though they were very close to the summit, since they had been waiting motionless for about 5 hours, they couldn't continue either. Naturally, everyone's only concern was to reach camp safely. Hall was initially, so to speak, dragged down. The fluids entering his body were just beginning to show their effect, so it was very difficult for him to walk on his own. But with the incredible effort of dozens of men for more than 10 hours, the team managed to take Hall from Everest's north face to the North Col camp, located at about 7,000 meters on the North Ridge. He had very serious injuries and ongoing, though milder, cerebral edema. After the preliminary treatment at that camp, when he was taken by stretcher to the advanced base camp at 6,400 meters, the severity gravity of the situation became more apparent. So much so that although he had incredibly overcome the life-threatening danger, he had irreversibly lost several fingers on his hands and feet. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the story, the fact that he even survived after spending so many hours half-dressed at such a high and cold place, just a few hundred meters from the summit, was a miracle. Of course, alongside this miracle, there was disappointment on one side. Mazur and his team, who had failed after months of work and so much money spent, were naturally both proud and sad, but they would repeatedly say they never regretted the decision they made. They hadn't reached the summit, but they had saved a human life. Naturally, the news of Hall's clinging to life had already begun spreading to the whole world at the speed of light. Here, for example, it wasn't Hall's clinging to life, but the fact that the man who was left for dead the day before had survived after spending a night in a place where there was almost no oxygen. When the news reached his grieving family, the house that had been in mourning suddenly turned into a place of celebration. He hadn't died. After the days spent in the hospital, he naturally understood the value of life much better. But this didn't curb his curiosity about summits. In the future, he would write about his experience. He would share in full detail what he experienced during the moments he was alone. Daniel and his team would naturally be declared heroes in the face of this situation. National Geographic magazine would honor them by showing them among the adventurers of 2006 with the title of Heroes of Everest. To cut a long story short, climbing to the summit was one thing. Deserving the summit was completely another. I don't know what you think, but I believe Mazur and his team, even though they didn't reach the summit that day, were the people who most deserved the summit. That's all from me for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, you can support me by following this channel. I'm Valorian. Don't forget to take care of yourselves until the next video.